In the riverside village of Narima, where the sun sparkled on the water like molten gold, there lived a girl named Amina. From the moment she could speak, her voice carried a melody that seemed to belong not only to her but to the river itself. Villagers often paused in their work to hear her sing, and even the birds in the trees would quiet their chirping, listening intently as her notes danced on the breeze. Her songs were not merely pretty sounds, they held a strange, quiet power. Storms that threatened the riverbanks would soften when her voice floated over the water. Children's scraped knees would sting less when she hummed nearby, and weary farmers found sudden strength and courage in her melodies. Every morning, Amina would rise before dawn and make her way to the river's edge. There, barefoot in the cool grass, she would dip her fingers into the water and let her voice drift along the currents. The river seemed to lean toward her, its surface shimmering with tiny ripples that mirrored the vibrations of her song. Fish leapt in rhythm with her notes, and reeds swayed as if nodding in approval. Amina herself would smile at these small acknowledgments, feeling a bond with the river that went deeper than anyone in the village could understand. It was as if the water listened, remembered, and responded to her heart. Yet not everyone admired her gift. In the same house where Amina lived with her father and stepmother, Malara, the stepmother, watched with quiet envy. Each day, she witnessed the villagers' attention drift away from her own family affairs toward the young girl whose laughter and song seemed to command the very elements. Malara was a woman of ambition and control, and Amina's innocent talents stung like a hidden thorn. "Why should all eyes turn to her while I am left unseen?" she muttered one afternoon, clenching her fists as Amina's voice floated through the open window, carrying the light of dawn to every corner of the village. Despite Malara's jealousy, Amina remained blissfully unaware of the dark stirrings of envy. She had learned only from the river, the birds, and the villagers' warm smiles. She sang not to impress or to compete, but because the melodies felt as natural as breathing. Sometimes, when her voice reached a particularly high or pure note, the river seemed to shiver, sending sparkling reflections dancing on the banks. It whispered to her in gentle ripples, a secret language only she could sense. It was a reassurance, a subtle foreshadowing that her gift was more than mere charm, that the water itself acknowledged her heart and strength. Villagers whispered among themselves, amazed at how Amina could bring calm where chaos had threatened. Fishermen spoke of the day a sudden storm had appeared, dark clouds rolling over the village like ominous blankets. Amina had sung from the river's edge, and within moments the wind softened, the waves smoothed, and the sky brightened once again. Even the elders, wise with years and cautious with superstition, nodded in awe. "There is something magical about her," they said quietly, exchanging glances that mixed wonder with cautious respect. But beneath the beauty of her gift lay a subtle warning, one that only the river seemed to understand. The currents whispered around her, the fish leapt higher, and the reeds bent closer, as if promising protection while also hinting at challenges yet to come. Amina's songs were not just melodies, they were threads of connection between her spirit and the living river, threads that could not be severed without consequences. And somewhere in the shadows of her home, Malara's jealousy festered, setting the stage for a conflict that would test not only Amina's extraordinary voice but the strength of her courage, wisdom, and heart. In the same riverside village of Narima, where Amina's songs had become the heartbeat of the community, shadows stirred not only in the forests but in the very house she called home. Malara, the stepmother, was a woman whose beauty had faded over years of ambition and bitterness. Her eyes, once soft, now flickered with sharp calculation, and her hands, delicate in appearance, twisted constantly with desire for control. She walked the halls with a silent fury, watching as Amina's melodies drew laughter, attention, and admiration from all who crossed the village. Every note Amina sang seemed to remind Malara of her own irrelevance, her lack of influence, and her failure to inspire the same devotion. Malara's envy was not quiet or fleeting, it consumed her every thought. She devised ways to diminish Amina, whispering false tales to villagers that the girl's talents were unnatural or dangerous. "Do not trust the river girl," she would murmur to the women at the market. "Her voice, it bends the mind and twists the heart. Who knows what she whispers to the water in secret?" Slowly, the village began to sense tension, a subtle unease surrounding Amina's otherwise pure presence. Children hesitated before her songs, elders cast wary glances, and even merchants felt an inexplicable chill when her voice carried too strongly over the river. Within the walls of the home, Malara's schemes deepened. She shadowed Amina, observing her routines and habits, learning every pattern of her singing and river walks. The stepmother spoke little to Amina directly, letting her fear grow silently, a psychological web that left the young girl vulnerable, isolated, and unaware of the depth of the danger she faced. Amina's father, gentle but distracted by his own small affairs, remained passive, unwilling or unable to intervene. He noticed Malara's quiet disapproval but dismissed it as the petty jealousy of a woman constrained by her own pride. This absence of protection left Amina exposed, her innocence both her greatest strength and her deepest vulnerability. Malara's envy would not have remained idle. She sought out forbidden knowledge in the darkest corners of the village and beyond. In the heart of the ancient forest, where whispers of spirits lingered in the fog and shadows of twisted trees seemed alive, Malara discovered a hidden path to a dark river spirit. Cloaked in mists and murmurs, the spirit promised power in exchange for secrecy and obedience. Malara's heart, driven by jealousy, greed, and the need to control, agreed without hesitation. She returned home with fragments of incantations, charms, and spells, each designed to dampen the vitality of Amina's voice, to sever her connection to the river, and to claim dominance over the girl's extraordinary gift. At night, while Amina slept beside the river, Malara whispered incantations into the wind, her words curling around the water like tendrils of smoke. The river itself, sensing the intrusion, rippled and quivered in resistance, but Malara pressed on, certain that her cunning and greed could bend even the living currents to her will. The villagers, unaware of the mystical battle brewing beneath the surface of their daily lives, merely noticed that Amina's laughter sometimes faltered, her songs occasionally trembled, and a shadow of tension began to settle over the riverside home. Malara's envy, dark and relentless, was a quiet storm building with every whispered incantation, every rumor spread, and every glance of disdain she cast toward Amina. It was a storm that threatened to drown the girl's song in silence. Yet, unbeknownst to Malara, the river had already begun to remember, to protect, and to whisper back. Amina's bond with the water, innocent and profound, had not gone unnoticed. And so, while the stepmother plotted the stage, the night was heavy with mist, and the river of Narima gleamed under a swollen moon, silver and restless. Malara approached Amina with a false sweetness, her smile soft yet edged with calculation. "Come," she whispered, "let us gather herbs by the river. The moon favors certain blooms tonight, and I thought you might teach me the song of the reeds." Amina, trusting and unknowing of the danger, nodded eagerly. Her bare feet brushed the dew-soaked grass as she followed her stepmother through the narrow path to the riverbank, her song trailing lightly in the air, a melody that seemed to blend with the murmur of water. Once they reached the river, Malara feigned curiosity, kneeling to examine the silver-green leaves of rare herbs. Amina leaned over the edge, tossing pebbles into the water, singing quietly to herself. The river responded as always, small ripples rose in rhythm to her voice, fish broke the surface, and reeds swayed as though bowing in reverence. But tonight, the currents ran darker, heavier, as if sensing the shadow of malice that had followed them. Malara's heart pounded with envy and anticipation. She had spent days learning the forbidden incantations, memorizing the silencing spell that would trap Amina's voice forever. The moment felt ripe. "Sing for me one last melody," Malara said, her voice trembling with false warmth. Amina's song floated across the river, pure and luminous, unaware of the danger lurking in every word. Then, in a swift, practiced motion, Malara whispered the spell, her hands tracing invisible symbols in the air. Amina's song faltered, her notes shivered and grew faint as if caught in a net of shadows. Confused, she leaned closer to the water, trying to understand the sudden distortion. Malara struck, pushing the girl into the river with force, her chant intensifying with each syllable. The current closed over Amina's head, swallowing her in cold, dark water. Villagers who had been asleep in their huts were awakened by a scream that tore through the night, a piercing, beautiful sound that echoed against the riverbanks. Yet when they ran to the water, their eyes met only a surface shimmering silver in the moonlight. No girl floated there, no hand reached out. Panic rose and shouts broke the night air. "Amina!" they cried, searching desperately, plunging torches into the darkness, their reflections trembling on the restless waves. But Amina's body had vanished, consumed by currents that held not destruction but a secret. Her essence lingered, entwined with the river itself. The village reeled in shock. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers banged on doors and boats, demanding answers. The air felt heavier, burdened with grief, disbelief, and anger. Whispers spread quickly, fueled by fear and sorrow. "She's gone, taken by the river." Some shook their heads, some fell to the ground in helpless weeping. Yet Malara remained calm, concealing her hands behind her back, feigning horror at what fate had wrought. Her practiced expressions of grief were precise, convincing, but her heart thrummed with triumph. Even as the village mourned, the river shimmered strangely under the moonlight. Currents swirled with a subtle rhythm, ripples curling into shapes that seemed almost intentional. Fish danced in arcs that traced invisible patterns, and the reeds bent closer to the surface, swaying in ways that mimicked Amina's gestures. Though Malara believed she had silenced the girl, the water carried a whisper of her essence. The river had not been fooled. It held her song, her spirit, and her will, a secret strength that no stepmother's greed or dark magic could extinguish entirely. As the night deepened, the river glimmered like a living memory, hinting at Amina's continued presence. While the villagers wept and searched, and Malara retired triumphantly to her home, the water sang softly, almost inaudibly, as if promising that this act of cruelty would not be the end. Somewhere beneath the silvery surface, Amina's voice lingered, a whisper of hope, a thread of defiance, a promise that even in the depths she was not lost. And so, the river became both a grave and a cradle, hiding her form while preserving her essence, foreshadowing the day when her song would rise again, not as a melody for mere amusement, but as a force of justice, memory, and undying courage. The river of Narima had always been alive with gentle currents and soft whispers, but after that fateful night, it became something more, a vessel for a spirit that refused to be silenced. Amina's essence lingered within its depths, ethereal and shimmering, like threads of silver woven through the water. Though her body had vanished, her consciousness had not. She could not step onto the riverbank nor touch the grass with her feet, but every ripple, every wave carried fragments of her presence. The river had become her voice, her refuge, and her instrument. Small signs of her lingering spirit began to appear almost immediately. Fish that once darted aimlessly now leapt in arcs that resembled the patterns of her melodies. Frogs and waterbirds seemed to respond to her unseen harmonies, croaking and calling in rhythm with the ghostly song that traveled beneath the surface. Reeds swayed in intricate patterns, almost like calligraphy, tracing invisible messages for those who might see them. Amina's spirit experimented, cautiously at first, nudging pebbles along the riverbed, shifting small branches and stirring the water in gentle spirals. Each movement carried intention, a language only partially understood but full of emotion, sorrow, and hope. The villagers, still grieving her disappearance, began noticing subtle anomalies along the river. At night, when the moon reflected upon the water, soft sounds of singing drifted across the banks. It was faint, almost dreamlike, but unmistakably melodic. Boats bobbed as if guided by invisible hands. Small waves seemed to answer silent questions with deliberate, gentle movements. Children, who had once been enchanted by Amina's voice, began to sense her presence in these quiet signs. They would press their ears to the water, listening intently, smiling at the whispers and harmonies only they could perceive. Malara, however, remained blind to the true nature of these phenomena. She noticed the oddities but dismissed them as tricks of the night or coincidences. "The river is restless," she muttered to herself, anxiety creeping into her voice, "but it means nothing." Her greed and obsession with control clouded her perception. She could not fathom that the girl she had tried to destroy now thrived in a form she could not touch. With each ripple and melody, the river seemed to mock her, silently reminding her that power could not be seized through cruelty alone. Amina, suspended between the physical world and the watery domain that had become her sanctuary, experienced a storm of emotions. She felt sorrow for the village that mourned her, longing for the life she had been stolen from, and frustration at her stepmother's blindness. Yet within her spirit also burned determination. She would not remain a passive victim. If she could not walk upon the riverbank, she would command the river itself. If her voice could not rise above the noise of grief and fear, she would become the wind in the reeds, the currents beneath the boats, the whispers in the reeds, guiding those who still believed in her toward hope and truth. Each night she pushed her influence a little further. She wove currents that carried messages, nudged fish to deliver signals, and shaped waves to reflect patterns reminiscent of her gestures. The river remembered everything, her laughter, her songs, and her presence, and in turn, it amplified her spirit. Amina realized that she had not been taken away, she had been transformed. The river had become her body, her instrument, and her ally, and through it she could whisper her defiance, her sorrow, and her song to a world that had tried to silence her. In that quiet, hidden symphony, the villagers slept, unaware of the profound magic stirring beneath the water. Malara slept too, oblivious to the power she had awakened. And the river sang, carrying Amina's memory through every ripple, every wave, every drop, a subtle promise that her song was far from gone. Days passed, and the villagers of Narima could no longer ignore the subtle signs that something extraordinary lingered by the river. At first it was small, almost dismissible, the gentle hum of a tune in the wind, the soft reflection of movement in water that did not match reality, a fleeting pattern of ripples that seemed almost deliberate. At night, some villagers dreamt of a girl singing beneath the moonlight, her voice threading through their thoughts, leaving them with a strange sense of calm or a sudden surge of hope. Children were the first to truly notice. Drawn to the river like moths to a flame, they ran barefoot along the banks, laughing as they repeated fragments of melodies they could not fully recall. "Did you hear that?" one child whispered to another, eyes wide. "It's Amina. She's singing to us." Their parents dismissed it at first, assuming it was imagination or playful mimicry. But the more the children played, the more distinct the tunes became, notes of joy, mischief, and kindness that seemed to wrap the village in a gentle embrace. The river responded to their delight, currents forming small, circular whirlpools that twinkled in the sunlight, as if acknowledging the children's recognition. Malara, meanwhile, grew increasingly unsettled. She prowled the riverbanks with her usual pretense of concern, attempting to assert dominance over the household and the village. She shouted at children who lingered too long by the water, waved her hands to dispel the currents, and cursed the occasional ripple that disrupted her carefully ordered world. Yet her efforts were continually foiled. Rocks she placed to block paths would shift, her firelight flickered unpredictably near the river, small fish darted through her traps, scattering and leaving her vexed. The subtle magic of the river, guided by Amina's spirit, had begun to assert itself, revealing that control through fear was no longer possible. Suspense spread among the villagers. Rumors of ghostly songs drifted from hut to hut. Some feared spirits of misfortune, whispering that the girl's disappearance had cursed the river. Others were drawn by fascination, gathering quietly at the banks at night to hear the faint, ethereal melodies. Mothers told their children to be careful, yet often left themselves listening in secret, hearts lifted by the impossible harmony that threaded through the reeds and the rippling water. The village was caught between awe and unease, uncertainty and hope. Amina, suspended in the watery currents, realized her influence over the village could extend beyond song alone. She began to experiment. A sudden shift in a current warned a villager of a lurking snake in the reeds. A pattern of ripples nudged a child toward safety as he balanced on a riverbank log. She guided the playful children, ensuring they repeated her melodies, even if they did not understand their origin, instilling courage and curiosity. The river had become both her voice and her hands, weaving subtle threads of protection, guidance, and reassurance into the lives of those she loved. Even from her unseen vantage, Amina felt a surge of bittersweet satisfaction. Though her stepmother had silenced her physical presence, she could still be heard, still be felt, still influence the world she had loved so dearly. Every ripple, every whisper of wind across the water, every splash of a fish, was a note in the growing symphony of her spirit. The villagers had not forgotten her, and soon they would learn that no darkness, no malice, could ever fully drown a song born of courage and love. And so the whispers continued. The river sang at night, faint but persistent, carrying fragments of Amina's voice to ears willing to listen. The children laughed, played, and sang along, unknowingly amplifying her spirit. Malara seethed, powerless to quell the currents, blind to the force she had awakened. And Amina, floating unseen beneath the surface, knew that even in absence, her song could reach the hearts of those who believed, planting hope and courage like seeds in fertile soil. Days turned into nights, and the river of Narima had become a living conduit for Amina's spirit. Restless beneath the surface, she longed to be seen, to be recognized, and to reach out to those she had loved. She experimented cautiously, testing the limits of her ethereal form. With concentration, she coaxed small reflections to rise on the water's surface, fleeting images of herself shimmering like silver mist. The villagers who wandered by at twilight gasped at the illusions. Some were certain they recognized the glint of her eyes or the curve of her smile. Others dismissed the fleeting visions as tricks of moonlight and imagination. The river rippled and swirled, responding to her emotions. When her heart ached for her lost home, the currents tightened into graceful spirals, shaping patterns that suggested gestures, hands, and movement. When she felt anger toward Malara, the water surged with subtle force, pushing aside floating leaves and twigs as if to assert presence. These attempts were exhausting. Her form was not yet whole, and she could only manifest partially, enough to hint at her being, but not enough to truly return. Still, each shimmering reflection carried a fragment of her song, a reminder that her spirit persisted, unbroken and defiant. Malara, sensing a shift in the river, became increasingly frantic. She attempted new rituals, scattering salt along the banks, lighting candles and chanting under the moonlight, and even offering small tributes to the dark spirits she had earlier invoked. Yet each spell failed, each charm dissolved in the first ripple, and each attempt only stirred the river's current more vividly. The water itself seemed to mock her, bending and twisting as though guided by an unseen hand. Malara's fury grew with each failure, her envy and fear intertwining, blinding her to the deeper magic at work, the living essence of Amina, still present and growing stronger. The villagers noticed small miracles accompanying these displays. A sick child who leaned toward the shimmering reflections felt a sudden warmth course through her limbs. A fisherman, lost in the fog along the river, found a current guiding his boat safely to shore. Tiny messages, almost imperceptible, wove themselves into the mundane. Amina's spirit had learned to communicate indirectly, sending warnings, comfort and guidance, shaping the village's lives without fully stepping into the physical world. Each success emboldened her, revealing new possibilities. Yet the experiment carried risks. Every partial manifestation required immense focus, leaving her vulnerable to fatigue and the current's unpredictable moods. Sometimes the reflections shimmered incorrectly, or the patterns confused rather than guided. Her longing to be whole, to walk again on the riverbank, pressed against the limits of her spirit. Could she, a fragment of her former self, influence events enough to exact justice or protect those she loved? Could her presence reach beyond the water's edge to confront Malara directly? Despite these uncertainties, Amina's resolve only grew. Each ripple, reflection, and subtle manipulation strengthened her connection to the river. She began to understand that the water was not merely a vessel, but a partner, amplifying her will and song. She could convey not only guidance and warnings but also emotions, sorrow, joy, and defiance, to the humans who were open to perceiving them. As night fell, the village settled once more along the banks, their eyes drawn to the silvered water. Children laughed at the playful glimmers, elders whispered of strange blessings, and Malara glared in impotent rage. Somewhere beneath the surface, Amina watched, practiced, and learned. She had taken her first step toward return, discovering that even bound to the river she could influence the world above, that her song, drowned though her body might be, still carried power. The river of Narima had become more than a refuge for Amina's spirit. It had become an army, a network of allies bound by her presence and song. Aquatic creatures, once simple and curious, now acted with purpose. Fish leapt to create ripples that guided villagers away from danger. Turtles shifted silently along the riverbed, nudging lost objects or messages toward those in need. Even the reeds seemed alive, bending and swaying in patterns that mirrored her intent. The river itself became an extension of her will, moving and shaping the world above without revealing the spirit that animated it. Amina began experimenting with subtle sabotage. One morning, Malara set out to block the river's edge with ropes and planks, hoping to restrict children from gathering at the water. The moment she approached, currents twisted beneath her hands, causing planks to drift and ropes to slip. Malara cursed and shouted, but her efforts were undone before she could regain control. Later, as she attempted a ritual using floating candles, a school of fish nudged the candles into the river's center, extinguishing the flames before the spell could take effect. Every attempt at domination was met with a clever, almost playful countermeasure from Amina's unseen hand. Her voice, carried invisibly through water, became a tool of strategy. Currents and ripples now synchronized with her song, communicating messages to the villagers. Fishermen found their nets guided toward abundant catches, lost children were subtly steered back to safety, and whispers of her song stirred courage in the hearts of those who felt fear. Even the elders who had once dismissed her disappearance as tragic, began to sense her presence, a comfort rather than a threat, a guide rather than a ghost. The villagers slowly learned to trust the river, speaking to it, listening to its subtle currents, and noticing patterns that seemed too deliberate to be mere coincidence. Children were the first to understand fully. They laughed along the banks, splashing and playing, imagining conversations with the invisible singer. "She's here," one boy shouted, pointing to a ripple that moved in time with his clap. "The river sings her name." Others joined in, following currents and tossing pebbles, interpreting the water's movement as playful signals from their friend Amina. The children began calling her the river singer, treating the river as a friend and protector rather than a dangerous body of water. Their laughter and joy echoed across the village, a living tribute to her enduring presence. Malara, however, could feel the shift with growing unease. Each day, her authority was challenged not by visible hands but by the invisible currents, the uncatchable movements, and the cleverness of a spirit she had tried to destroy. She became restless, moving from room to room, inspecting the river, muttering curses, and attempting increasingly desperate rituals. Candles would refuse to stay lit, charms would twist and fall. The tiniest of her movements were countered by the subtle power flowing through water. Her fear was compounded by the villagers' changing behavior. Children daring to play near the river, adults cautiously trusting the river's guidance, and whispers of blessing spreading across homes. Amina felt both joy and sorrow as she witnessed this shift. Her allies, the fish, the turtles, the reeds, and the river itself, worked in harmony. With her, carrying her will outward. She could no longer walk among humans, but she could shape their lives, protect them, and exact small measures of justice. Her sorrow at being separated from her body was tempered by the knowledge that her influence was growing, her voice now more than a sound, it was a force, a presence, a guide for all who would listen. By nightfall, the river glimmered under moonlight, alive and vibrant. Ripples danced in subtle, intricate patterns, and currents whispered secrets along the banks. Villagers slept knowing the river watched over them, children dreaming of the playful spirit within the water. Malara stood on the banks, heart pounding with anger and fear, sensing resistance she could not fully grasp. The tension in the village thickened like fog, a quiet storm building under the moon's silver glow. And beneath it all, unseen but unstoppable, Amina's spirit prepared to shape the coming days, teaching the village that her song, though drowned, could never truly be silenced. The village of Narima had grown quiet along the riverbanks, but the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the surface, currents carried secrets that only a few wise eyes could perceive. Elder Tavia, known for her understanding of hidden forces, began noticing oddities. The river's whispers seemed structured, deliberate, like fragments of a warning woven into the water's flow. Fish leapt in peculiar sequences, leaves floated in unnatural patterns, and sudden gusts of wind carried faint, haunting echoes of a melody no one could place. Elder Tavia sensed the threads of a darker magic at work, and her heart grew heavy with foreboding. Amina's spirit, suspended beneath the river's surface, watched the villagers' cautious investigation with satisfaction. She could manipulate currents to reveal just enough, fragments of information, hints of danger, patterns that spoke of forbidden acts. Slowly, she guided Tavia toward the truth. The rituals that Malara had employed to silence her were not mere superstition, but structured incantations imbued with the river's own natural forces twisted for malice. The elder discovered faint residues along the banks, blackened stones, scorched reeds, and water-soaked charms that seemed to pulse faintly with the remnants of the dark magic. Each clue pointed to a larger, more dangerous ritual waiting to unfold, one that could bind the river and its spirit forever if left unchecked. The river itself acted as both messenger and guardian. Currents tugged at objects to reveal hidden components. A jar of herbs washed into view, a fragment of parchment entangled in reeds, a small obsidian talisman lodged among river rocks. Anyone attentive enough to notice would see the danger creeping closer. Children who played along the banks whispered to one another about the river showing them secrets, repeating bits of melody that sounded like clues. The village slowly began to understand that the water was no longer passive. It spoke, guided, and warned, carrying the fragmented story of Malara's dark ambitions. Malara, meanwhile, grew desperate. Each of her attempts to fortify her rituals was subtly undone. Currents shifted candles from their carefully drawn circles, flames flickered in unpredictable patterns, and her whispered incantations returned to her in echoes of mockery. She could sense an invisible hand resisting her magic, but she could not identify the source. Her fear turned into obsession, and her obsession into frantic action. She prowled the banks at night, muttering curses and invoking spirits she had once controlled, but each incantation failed or produced chaotic results. The river pulsed with a quiet defiance, carrying Amina's influence in ways Malara could neither anticipate nor control. Amina's spirit felt the growing tension and the nearing moment of confrontation. She was still tethered to the water, unable to step fully into the village, but she realized her influence was reaching a critical point. Each ripple, every subtle shift of the current, every flicker of reflection on the water's surface became part of a larger strategy. She could manipulate perception, plant courage in the villagers' hearts, and expose Malara's machinations. In her mind, she rehearsed patterns of guidance and subtle sabotage, preparing the village for the eventual reckoning. Elder Tavia, following the river's hints, pieced together the ritual's components and its vulnerabilities. The villagers began to sense a faint, growing power coursing through the water. The song beneath the surface swelled subtly, threaded with warning and purpose. Malara, unaware that her plans were being unraveled before her eyes, tightened her grip on fear and control, unknowingly setting herself against forces far stronger than her dark arts. In that tense liminal space, the river pulsed with anticipation. Amina, learning the rhythm of her powers, prepared for a more complete manifestation. Her strategy was clever, indirect, and precise. She would strike not with brute force, but through intelligence, timing, and the subtle orchestration of her watery allies. The river held its breath, and with it, the village waited unknowingly on the cusp of justice. Night had fallen over the village of Narima, and the river glimmered under the moon's silver gaze, alive with unseen energy. Malara, desperate and consumed by envy, stepped onto the banks, carrying her ritual tools, candles, obsidian talismans, and parchments inscribed with incantations meant to bind and destroy. Her heart pounded, yet her hands were steady, fueled by fear that her power was slipping. She began the chants, her voice harsh and commanding, cutting through the quiet night. Sparks of unnatural light flickered along the river's surface, signaling the awakening of her dark magic. Beneath the water, Amina stirred. She had felt the intrusion, sensed Malara's intent, and prepared to defend herself. With focused determination, she called upon the river's currents, letting them swirl in intricate patterns that mirrored the rhythm of her pulse. Small waves danced like living fingers, redirecting the ritual's energy back toward Malara. She projected shimmering illusions of herself above the water, flickering forms that seemed to step from one ripple to the next, making it impossible for Malara to discern the real presence from the reflection. Each song she sang flowed invisibly through the currents, a melody that unsettled the ritual, distorted the incantations, and whispered warnings to the villagers watching from the edges of the banks. The villagers had gathered, drawn by flickers of light and the strange hum of the river. Some pressed their hands to their mouths in fear, others craned their necks in awe, watching as the night transformed into a spectacle of the supernatural. Reflections of a young girl shimmered across the water, her voice threading through the reeds, and currents rose and fell in harmony with her will. Sparks of magic from Malara's tools sputtered and vanished into the air, swallowed by the river's protective embrace. Even the reeds along the riverbank swayed unnaturally, forming patterns that seemed to shield the girl's presence, nudging Malara's spells away from their intended target. Malara's anger surged. "Come forth. Face me," she cried, striking at the illusions, slashing at the air, desperate to capture and crush what she could not fully see. Each failed attempt only deepened the river's resistance. Waves rose higher, small whirlpools forming beneath the floating candles, extinguishing them before the dark energy could anchor. Fish darted around her, nudging objects into the current, tripping her, overturning small rituals she had prepared. Malara's shouts became frantic and her chants faltered, the carefully measured rhythm disrupted by forces beyond her control. Amina's voice wove through it all, soft yet commanding, a melody of defiance, protection, and justice. She was no longer merely defending herself. She orchestrated the river like an unseen conductor, turning every element, water, fish, wind, and light, into allies. The river itself had become a participant in the confrontation, actively shielding Amina while punishing Malara's greed and cruelty. Its currents carried not just protection but subtle lessons. Greed cannot bind what belongs to the world, cruelty cannot silence what is righteous. Villagers began murmuring, half in fear, half in wonder. They saw the impossible, water twisting unnaturally, lights flickering with life, and a young girl's presence felt everywhere though seen by few. The lines between reality and illusion blurred, leaving them uncertain of what was natural and what was the hand of the river's guardian. In their hearts, however, a new respect began to grow for the river, its mysterious power, and the girl who had become its voice. And beneath the moonlit surface, Amina felt the surge of her growing agency. She had defended herself, disrupted Malara, and inspired awe in those who witnessed the event. Yet she knew the confrontation was not over. The river, her allies, and her song were ready, but to reclaim her agency fully, to return not just in spirit but in presence, she would need to take the final step, clever and decisive, against the darkness that sought to drown her. The river of Narima seemed to hold its breath as Amina's spirit prepared for the climactic confrontation. Night had fallen like a velvet curtain, and the moon shimmered across the water's surface, illuminating every ripple with silver light. Malara approached once more, clutching her obsidian talisman and parchment scrolls, chanting dark incantations meant to crush the spirit that had eluded her for so long. But tonight, the river itself pulsed with anticipation, ready to aid the girl it had silently nurtured. Amina gathered the last fragments of her strength, allowing her song to resonate through every current and wave. Her melody, once gentle and playful, had transformed into a commanding force of nature, echoing with sorrow, defiance, and power. Each note carried intention, weaving together currents, river creatures, and light into a single, unstoppable expression of will. The water surged with her voice, twisting and curling around Malara, disrupting her rituals. Candles flickered and toppled, ink ran across parchments, and the talisman itself vibrated violently, as if resisting the very energy Malara tried to impose upon it. Suddenly, a whirlpool erupted in the river's center, not chaotic but precise, drawing Malara toward its swirling heart. Her screams cut through the night, mingling with the river's gurgling roar and Amina's song, creating a chorus of justice that resonated across the banks. The villagers gasped, some retreating in fear, others frozen in awe as the currents twisted into impossible shapes, spirals, arches, and shimmering pillars of water, reflecting the girl's spirit more fully than ever before. Amina's form appeared in these reflections, radiant and commanding, her eyes glowing like the river's core, her presence undeniable. Malara struggled against the whirlpool, but her spells, designed to bind Amina, now ensnared her instead. Every incantation she uttered fed into the river's power, amplifying the current's strength. The obsidian talisman and parchment crumbled in her hands, and her dark magic turned inward, wrapping her in illusions of her own greed and cruelty. She saw herself trapped in endless repetition, her own vanity, her envy, her desire to dominate, reflected in every wave and ripple. The villagers watched, wide-eyed, as Malara's arrogance and malice were undone by her own devices. The river carried her away gently yet firmly, leaving no trace that she could return to cause harm again. Amina's voice soared above the water, a song of victory and release. The melody was no longer sorrowful but filled with hope, echoing through every home, brushing the leaves of trees and carrying across the fields. The villagers, who had once trembled at the river's whispers, now felt its warmth and guidance. Children danced along the banks, mimicking her notes, while elders whispered blessings, acknowledging the magic that had defended and protected them. The river's currents shimmered, playful yet reverent, responding to the presence of the girl who had turned loss into triumph. For the first time since her drowning, Amina's spirit felt the fullness of connection. Though her body remained beneath the surface, her presence was manifest, tangible in the ripples, the fish that leapt in synchronized arcs, the gentle sway of the reeds, and the light dancing across the water. She had reclaimed her agency entirely, using intelligence, patience, and the natural allies of the river to achieve justice without spilling unnecessary harm. In that moment, the village understood the balance of power and consequence. The river was no longer merely a source of water, but a guardian, a teacher, and a conduit of truth. Malara's cruelty had been exposed and undone, not through brute force alone, but through Amina's clever orchestration of forces beyond the visible world. The song that had been drowned now echoed stronger than ever, a reminder that light and virtue cannot be silenced so long as they have allies, seen or unseen. As dawn approached, the river glimmered with renewed life, carrying Amina's melody far beyond the village. Villagers felt hope restored, and the waters hummed softly with the promise of protection and harmony. Though she had no physical form, Amina's spirit was fully present, commanding the currents, shaping the world, and reminding all who listened. A song may be drowned, but its echoes will always return. With Malara's dark influence finally undone, the river of Narima flowed calmer than it had in months, yet it carried a new, vibrant energy. Amina's spirit, fully awakened and attuned to the water, began the gentle work of restoration. Her songs threaded through the currents, soft and deliberate, reaching into every corner of the village to mend the damage left behind by fear, envy, and dark magic. Fields once flooded with chaos and twisted soil now shimmered with fertility, each plant responding to the invisible touch of the river's guardian. Reeds straightened, fish swam in harmonious schools, and even the stones along the banks seemed to settle, smoothing over scars of the past. Villagers gathered along the riverbanks, initially hesitant, unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. Slowly they began to notice subtle changes. Water flowing more gently, light dancing on the surface in rhythmic patterns, and the familiar echo of Amina's song carrying warmth and reassurance. Elders whispered among themselves, piecing together the truth they had only glimpsed in fragments before, that the girl's spirit, though unseen, had acted as a force of balance and guidance. Mothers and fathers encouraged their children to watch the river, to listen, and to pay attention to the subtle signs that had always existed but had been overlooked. Children were the first to truly understand. They laughed and splashed in the newly clear water, sensing Amina's presence in every ripple and wave. One little girl pointed at a shoal of fish that danced in perfect sync with the melody carried by the currents. "She's helping us," the child exclaimed. "She's making the river happy again." Others joined in, following the movements of floating leaves, tossing pebbles, and learning that even small actions could interact with the unseen forces guiding them. Amina's influence taught them that resilience and cleverness often reside in what is hidden, in what seems lost or powerless at first glance. Meanwhile, adults began to repair both physical and emotional scars. Families rebuilt homes damaged during the turmoil, guided by subtle nudges from the water. A fallen beam shifted, a missing tool floated to the surface, patterns in the current showing where to work first. The villagers' hearts softened, and mistrust that had festered under Malara's shadow slowly faded. Conversations once filled with fear and suspicion became filled with curiosity, awe, and gratitude. They recognized that the river, and the spirit within it, had protected them not through intimidation, but through subtle intelligence and steadfast care. Amina herself felt a quiet satisfaction. She could not step onto the banks, but her presence was deeply felt, stronger than ever. The river had become both her body and her voice, carrying her intention into every corner of the village. She guided, healed, and nurtured, reinforcing the lessons of vigilance, awareness, and the hidden power of cleverness and courage. Each act of restoration, no matter how small, rippled outward, creating harmony not only in the natural world but also in the hearts of those she had protected. By evening, the village shimmered with renewed life. Children skipped along the banks, their laughter mingling with the river's gentle hum. Farmers found hope in their fields, elders in their hearts, and families in one another. Amina's melody carried through the air, a soft promise that even when one's body is gone, the essence of courage, intelligence, and compassion can continue to guide and protect. Her connection to the river had become more than a mere presence. It was a symbol of resilience, unseen strength, and the subtle power that exists in all things, waiting to be noticed by those willing to listen. And so the village of Narima learned that even what seemed lost could still shape the world, and that harmony often emerges from patience, trust, and the quiet, unseen efforts of those who refuse to be silenced. Generations had passed since that fateful night along the riverbanks of Narima, yet the story of Amina, the girl whose song could not be silenced, lived on in every heart and home. Parents whispered it to their children as they dipped their hands into the flowing water, teaching them to listen carefully to the currents and the rustling reeds. The river, once a stage for fear and cruelty, now sang eternally with her spirit, carrying lessons of courage, cleverness, and resilience into every corner of the village. Children were the first to feel the power of the tale. They would play along the riverbanks, skipping stones, chasing ripples, and listening to the faint melodies that sometimes danced upon the water. "That's Amina," one would cry, pointing to the shimmering reflections on the surface. "She's singing to us." Their laughter and games became an acknowledgement of unseen allies, a recognition that not all strength is visible, and that courage can exist in places one cannot see, in the depths of water, in the wind through the reeds, in the silent whisper of nature itself. Villagers of all ages began to approach the river with reverence rather than fear. Fishermen paused to honor the currents before casting nets, mothers knelt to let their children drink from its cool waters, and elders whispered songs of protection, blending their voices with the river's eternal hum. The rituals had changed, no longer designed to dominate or control but to honor, to connect, and to protect. Every song, every act of respect, was a tribute to Amina's enduring spirit, a recognition that even when silenced, truth and virtue have a way of finding expression. Teachers in the village made it a point to emphasize subtle lessons. Strength does not always reside in muscle or in the ability to shout louder than others, they would tell children. Sometimes, it is the cleverness that guides us, the courage that hides in patience, and the allies we cannot see but who watch over us. They spoke of Amina's cunning, her ability to act indirectly through the river, and her clever orchestration of currents, fish, and whispers, showing that victory over cruelty and injustice often requires intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of one's surroundings. Elders also reminded everyone that fear is a poor guide, and that respect for natural forces is the truest path to harmony. The river, which had once been feared as a tool of malevolent magic, had transformed into a living teacher, singing lessons through the wind in its reeds, the light on its ripples, and the patterns of fish in its waters. Even when they try to silence you, the elders would say, "Your song, your truth, will find a way to be heard." Stories of Amina's final confrontation with Malara became central to village culture. They were told with vivid detail, the whirlpool that reflected greed, the illusions that misled the cruel, the river's clever manipulation, and the triumphant melody that restored balance. Children acted out the story in plays, using shadows, water, and songs to bring the legend to life, while adults listened, reflecting on the moral. Justice and courage are not always immediate or visible, but persistent and guided by cleverness, they can restore harmony. Even centuries later, travelers who passed through Narima would feel the river's unique presence. Those who paused to listen could hear a faint, ever-present song, a melody that seemed to flow from the waters themselves, a song of defiance, hope, and resilience. They would hear the echoes of Amina's laughter, her courage, and her unwavering spirit, and leave with the knowledge that the river carried a living memory, teaching anyone willing to hear that power often lies not in force, but in truth, cleverness, and the invisible threads that bind allies to those who act with integrity. And so the village of Narima thrived, guided by the eternal song of Amina, the girl whose spirit could not be drowned. The river sang her name endlessly, a melody of courage and cleverness, a reminder that even when they try to silence you, your song, your truth, will always find a way to be heard.